talk people into that they need something desperately, right, or whatever it is. And we sell, right? We all sell. We all sell. So it's a great skill. It's an amazing, amazing skill. So the much greater challenge, though, is to convince somebody to believe something that he purportedly heard, saw, experienced, or felt. Now you're going into the realm of really, really, really difficult. To go convince people, huge numbers of people, that they actually experienced something that they didn't is a very difficult thing. Every single religion, and literally every single religion, got started the same way. We're going to talk a little bit about some others that have a slightly different narrative, but basically the same way. They all follow the sort of the formula that's spelled out in the the How to Start a Religion guidebook. One man comes, or a small group come, and they say, I had a vision, we had an experience, and charismatic, usually smooth talking, whatever it might be, powerful in some ways, they saw or they spoke to God. Some people won't believe, some people will believe. The ones who believe, they become the faithful, and it also really depends on how powerful a storyteller, an imagination, a visionary this person could be. And there's a simple reason why religions start this way. Because if somebody tries to convince others that they experienced it, it's very, very difficult, almost impossible, to convince people that they saw, heard, experienced something that they had no experience of. What we would then say to them is, go sell somebody else the Brooklyn Bridge. Go, thank you very much, but no thank you. Now, if we look back at how the Torah describes the events at Sinai, they describe it very, very differently. How many indications are there that God spoke to all of the people? Imagine that instead of constantly saying you, Moshe would have said me. God spoke to me. Instead of saying God spoke to you, imagine Moshe would have said, God spoke to me, saying, at this experience, this event at Sinai. Okay? That would be sort of the normal course that all religions follow. Moshe comes at some point to the people and he says, God spoke to me, follow me. Right? However, telling all of the Jews that they saw the vision, that they experienced it, etc., it's a very tough sell if it doesn't happen. Okay? This is sort of what we call a checkable. You can actually check this information, or they could have checked the information, by turning to the guy next to them and said, yeah, wow, that was amazing. Was that, did you really, that was weird, but did you really also, did you feel that? I'm not sure. Somebody there is going to be a skeptic. Okay? So this lie is a very hard one to sell to an entire group or nation. So the present theory doesn't work very well to start this lie. Okay? It's very, very difficult. If you would say that they were all mentally impaired, high on something, with so many Nobel Prize winners who came out of them, how mentally impaired were they at the time? They're pretty bright people that, genetically they work, right? So this is why the present theory doesn't work for me, and it didn't work for the Rambam, and it didn't work for all of our bubbies and zadies. So it's pretty unreasonable to assume that someone was able to convince all of the people that they themselves experienced Sinai. If, however, somebody would have made the claim that that only he experienced it, and you should all follow me, and I'm sharing it with you, okay, that's like many, many other religions. But that's not the claim he makes, or that's not the claim the Torah makes. The Torah makes a very different claim. The Torah says that God showed himself to all of you. It was a once-in-a-lifetime event. It never happened. It won't happen again. It's not going to happen to another people. This is what it was. So that theory is very hard to replicate, or to even imagine somebody making a claim like that. Perhaps the better claim, the better lie, would be the past lie. That this is something that occurred in the past, and somebody comes along and says, look, once upon a time, our ancestors, they were all at Sinai, this was forgotten, it wasn't spoken about, but now is the time to go and put this in writing and learn it and study it and teach it to our children, and we have to learn it in all of this. Problem is I have a lot of doubts about this theory too. Fred, remember Fred, he doesn't try to convince them that they heard or saw God, because as we said, that's a wild kind of statement. Instead, what he says is that their grandparents saw God, right? So the first problem with this theory is, when a person approaches you and tells you about an event in history that is an enormous event, a large event, a huge event, a life-changing event, literally a nation-altering thing, and you say that it happened to you, it happened to your family, it happened to your ancestors, it happened to our nation, our group, our people, it happened to them a couple hundred years ago, the first question that's going to be, what's going to be the person's first question? What's the first question? Yeah?
Why are you the only one that seems to know about it?
How come I don't know about it? How come nobody else knows about this? Where did this come from? How come my grandparents didn't know? How come nobody else knew? Okay? This is a key factor in why this is so implausible or unusual for somebody to believe this. Now, there are different types of events in history, as we'll see. There are some events you would expect not to know. If somebody were to tell you, well, actually, let's do text 4 first. Somebody read page 197.
Imagine someone making up this story and trying to sell it. He's going to come to a group of people and he's going to tell them that sometime in the past, the ancestors stood at a mountain and heard God speak. He's not talking about people in China or Tibet. He's talking about the ancestors of his audience. He's claiming that God revealed himself to all the ancestors simultaneously and by so doing founded a new religion. What is the question with which the audience will confront him? The obvious question is, if this happened to our ancestors, how is it that no one knows about it but you? What happened to the memory of that event? Everybody simply forgot it? They were more interested in the soccer scores? No one told us about it. The whole religion just disappeared? It is simply not credible to tell an entire nation that their collective ancestors witnessed such an earth-shattering event and that it was forgotten. It would be impossible to explain why the memory of the event disappeared. The person inventing the story and trying to sell it would never succeed.
So say, for example, Fred came along and he told us that around the year 1919, America became a communist country, and there were huge gulags set up in Arkansas, and people were imprisoned there, and then about 1924 it reverted back to some kind of democracy. You'd look at him like, it's crazy, unless you believe that we're not a democracy today, and then maybe you believe it. So, you weren't alive then. Why wouldn't you believe him? And the reason is very simple, because how come nobody told me about this? What kind of bubba says this? It can't be true, I would have heard about it. What happens if Fred came along and said that in Madagascar about the year 1919 till 1924 it turned communist? We'd probably shrug our shoulders and say, oh, never knew that. Yeah, I don't know much about Madagascarian history. I don't know what the word is. The history of Madagascar. Maybe it did go communist. I don't know. I don't think so. But who knows? It wouldn't be important to us. You could tell a story about somebody else, something that's insignificant to us, and we would, yeah, fine. I mean, why not? Guy's charismatic. It seems like he knows what he's talking about. Maybe he has credentials. Okay, great. No problem. I believe you. But now when you tell me something about something that I should know, that I ought to be aware of, that all of us ought to have known, you can't tell me a story that's completely fabricated and expect the rest of us, or all of us, or many of us to believe it. There's a rule about which lies are believable. And the rule of thumb is the listener supposed to be knowledgeable in it or not? You only make a lie in something that you expect the listener not to any, but if the listener is supposed to know, you can't lie about it. You can't just make something up, because the listener will be skeptical, will look into it, will find out, will dig, or just will plain out not believe it because it's so fantastic. I should have known about this. So as long as you tell a lie that doesn't violate this rule, you're pretty safe. You know, it can hold up for a while. Today it's a little harder, you know, so why isn't it in Wikipedia, you know? Well, why not? But for the longest time, as long as the lie was sort of skirting the edges of what should be known to people, you're fine. But as long as it's supposed to be something that ought to be known, it's a very problematic kind of lie. So Fred made up the story that the Jewish people witnessed God at Mount Sinai, and all of Jewish life is dependent on this event, and how come nobody knew about it? Only Fred knows about it. These questions are going to trip up the lie. Now, it's normal for groups to forget sort of their collective history, parts of their collective history. That's very, very normal and common. So, if Fred came to a group of Bedouins and said, you know, your ancestors used to have this form of making canoes in the desert, I don't know, on the Mediterranean, whatever. And it may be forgotten to you, but I found evidence of it, and I know of it, and it's sort of been handed down to my family. I'm sure they'd be very interested. I'm sure that's fine. Because it's a piece of knowledge, it's a small piece, it's not a central piece to their history, to their survival, to who they are, and to what they are. But to make up a story that, again, that's so central to their existence is a major problem. That's problem number one. Problem number two is we have a problem. Who is Fred? Who is this Fred? Name four of the greatest Jewish leaders of all time. Charlton Heston, good. Who else? Rashi. Maimonides. Moses. Let's go to biblical times. Four. What was that? Abraham. David. Saul, Samuel, whatever. Ezra, Nehemiah, right? Prophets, whatever. So how come nobody mentions Fred? And what do I mean by that? So who's the guy who restored this central idea of Judaism? He was a Lamed, right? But why did they keep him secret? Now he comes out and he convinces everybody that this is what happened. He reminds everybody of their collective history. He writes it down. They believe it. They take it on and whatever. And we have no idea who it is. So it's a group of people. It's the Anshe Knesset HaGedolah. How come we have no record of these people coming along and reminding the Jewish people of their shared history, their shared past? There is no Fred. Now, by the way, these are people who we venerate. These are people who we write great things about. These were great leaders. We record all of their the greatest events in their history and what they did and what they restored and what they brought about. And yet, there's no mention of the fact that this was the guy who taught us all that our ancestors had been there at Sinai. Such a central event that the Torah itself says that this is the core. This is the central factor in its entire story. No author. How come we don't know who Fred is? Let's take a look at text 5. Aaron, if you read.
A major problem with this theory is we've never heard of Fred or his heroic resurrection of Judaism. Certainly one of the most significant events in Jewish history would have been the fumble, when world Jewry forgot they were the 3 million prophets, and the recovery when Fred reminded the Jews about the national prophecy at Mount Sinai.
The Immaculate Reception, right?
Yet in an otherwise comprehensive Jewish history, we find no mention of such a claim. Jewish texts describe myriad historical crises and the heroes who assisted during these difficult times. We know that most Mishnah, and that Ravina and Rav Ashi compiled the Talmud. We know about Maimonides, thank you, and hundreds of other stars of medieval Jewry and what their respective contributions were. We possess detailed records about every Jewish personality except for one. We don't have any mention of the man who reminded Jewry that they were the only people in human history ever to experience national prophecy, and we don't have any record of the amnesia Fred rescued them from. Until 200 years ago, every Jew and member of a Jewish breakaway group, like the Christians, Sadducees, and Karaites, affirmed that ancient Jewry, their direct ancestors, had experienced national prophecy at Mount Sinai. Not a single ancient or contemporary individual or religious community has any tradition about the man who should have been the second greatest hero of Jewish history. Fred. Why?
So we could claim that Fred was maybe intentionally wiped out of the Jewish record. But again, why? Why would Fred and his story and his amazing, reminding us of who we were and what our history was, why would we wipe him out of the record? According to the past theory, this theory of the past, the generation that he convinced obviously regarded him as a tremendous hero, because they were willing to go along with this and to write it down into the record and all of these things. They certainly believed him. They ascribed to his story. So they passed down the Torah to the next generation as it was told to them by Fred, but somehow they erased Fred from the record. Why? Why erase Fred? Either way, erasing Fred from the record certainly brings us into conspiracy theory as to some kind of wild conspiracy as to why they might have done this. And perhaps, nobody actually ever landed on the moon. So for someone who's unable or unwilling to accept somehow the divinity of the Torah or the Revelation, this might be the best option, even if it's a stretch. But for one who believes in God, and that God is somehow involved in his world, this claim that Fred was erased for some reason is no more rational than to accept that the events at Sinai occurred. So it sounds unreasonable to assume that someone would be able to either falsely convince a group of people that every single one of their ancestors experienced a most unbelievable event of divine revelation. The listeners would, first of all, be expected to know something about it, and if they didn't know about it, they would not accept it. And the absence of this great leader in our historical record is another very weak link in this argument. I want to present a third option. I'm going a little over time today, just a couple, and that is the snowball theory. So there's another theory that's used to explain it, and that would be sort of a mixture of both of these. So Moshe comes down and from way back when, and he says to them, and maybe to a few other people, he says, I saw God appearing on the mountain, and he gave me and maybe a small group of people the Torah. And because the Jews were so impressionable and Moshe's charisma, like we described earlier, all the other religions, they believed him. They believed him that God gave him the Torah, and sort of this got the ball rolling. This got the whole thing started. So this is not a claim of mass revelation. This is a claim of an individual or a small group of people revelation. And only he or a few people witness God. And this is a lie that absolutely can't be told, and it's been told many, many times since then. So this is how every religion basically begins. Now, over the years, somewhere along the line, it snowballs, according to this theory. Over thousands of years, the lie grows, into this huge myth of mass revelation. Every time the story is retold, maybe on Pesach, right? When we get together, so we add some new details, some embellishments to the story. And by the end of the story, a few thousand years later, or 1,000 years later, everybody now believes that they were actually there. Okay? Now, there's a problem with this telling of the theory of the story also. The story changing from the me story to the we story is, or to the all of us story, is actually an extraordinary jump. And so let's see if that's really possible to make a jump like that in the world of lies, okay? So I don't think it is, and here's some of the reasons. So let's turn on page 200. Dr. Mervis, you've never read for us, and I'd love to hear your reading skills, if that's okay.
The beginnings of all ancient and modern religions have a common thread. One or two people have a revelation and persuade others to follow. Thus, for example, Buddhist writings tell us that Prince Siddhartha Gautama launched Buddhism after his solitary ascendance from the 8 stages of transic insight. Islamic texts tell us that Muhammad founded Islam following the first of many personal prophetic experiences. Christian writings reveal that Paul first met Jesus, converted to Christianity, and spread the faith more than 3 decades after Jesus' death. Joseph Smith Jr. and his partner Oliver Cowdery launched the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, the Mormon Church, after the 2 men were visited by angels and long-dead disciples of Jesus. And Sun Myung Moon launched the Unification Church after privately receiving direct orders to do so from Jesus himself. The beginnings of Children of God, Christian Science, Ekander, Elan Vital, I Am, and Theosophy. In fact, the beginnings of all world religions are equally unverifiable. Never does a large, clearly identifiable group of people experience prophecy and live to tell others about it. Moreover, in a handful of cases wherein large groups of people supposedly witness miracles, rarely are these witnesses named or identified in any way that would allow for verification. And in the very exceptional cases involving clearly identified groups of witnesses, never more than 1 or 2 of the religion's current adherents claim to have met or descended directly from the named witnesses. In all these cases, the religion's credibility rests on the credibility of its 1 or 2 founders. While it is certainly possible that the beginnings claimed by any of the thousands of sects and cults included in the world's more than 300 major religious traditions could be true, it is easy to imagine how charismatic charlatans could have launched any of these movements. The one known exception to this rule is Judaism.
Okay. One second. Hang on, I know. One more reading. Michael, please read for us 6b. I know that's why you were raising your hand, but loud and clear, not,
Okay.
blah, 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 blah.
Some Indian groups once possessed an oral tradition that the Hindu god Krishna addressed the millions of warriors who participated in the battle described in the Bhagavad Gita, a basic Hindu text. This is not a challenge to observations, however, since the same oral tradition also reports that all those who heard Krishna speak died in the battle. No witnesses survived to testify to the experience, and the story of this mass prophecy is only known because the god revealed it to an unnamed individual later in history.
Okay. So, this is not a question of belief, what we're saying here. This is a question of fact. There is no other religion that makes the claim that Judaism makes in terms of a mass revelation. Okay? That's a fact. That's not a belief. So this might elevate Judaism's claim over other faiths, but that's not what we're trying to talk about over here. Our goal here is to understand why the snowball theory is problematic, okay, or not tenable. So does this point, that Judaism is the only religion to make such a claim of mass revelation, does it somehow negate or somehow weaken the snowball theory? And I would say it does, and here's why. Say a guy comes holding a piece of gold in his hand, and he tells you that this was actually cow manure, I don't know what, a year ago, 100 years ago, and then it turned to gold, and here it is. So what is the first thing that you're going to say? The first thing you're going to say, I wouldn't say he's an alchemist. I would say, can you do it again? That's what I would say. I would say, if you can do that again, I'm in. I'll buy stock in that company, right? It's a rule in physics, but it's also a rule in history. The rule in physics is that anything that can occur in a natural way, it has to happen more than once. In other words, you want to see it replicated. Same thing in social sciences. We identify trends in human behavior, in human history, and observable sort of in societies as well. So something that occurs naturally on a social level is expected to happen again. It's expected to replicate itself. So this applies to world events. And this is why we have the famous statement that history repeats itself. Okay? So here we're going to discuss this a little bit further about history repeating itself. Text 7. A basic assumption of scientific method is that results are replicable. If something happens naturally once, we expect that it will happen more than once. Although history is not science, everyone knows that history repeats itself. Not in every last detail, but at least in general. Thousands of religions have existed in the world. Nobody has documented a single one that has the same claim as Judaism. If the story evolved naturally, or it was perpetrated as a hoax, why has it not happened more than once? And since it hasn't, is it irrational to believe in Sinai? Who is relying on blind faith? The one who believes in the story as written, or the one who claims without any historical support that it's a result of natural processes, but only happened one time to one group in all of recorded history? And this simple objection will apply to any natural explanation that anyone will ever propose to discredit the authenticity of the Sinai revelation. If it is natural, sort of this is how things go. Somebody makes a claim and it snowballs and it grows into a claim of everybody, then why did it happen only once in recorded history? So no other religion ever snowballed from a mini revelation to a mass revelation. Despite thousands and thousands of religions over history, nobody ever claimed it. And the above point sort of undermines the snowball theory. As we said before, past theory, present theory, and every theory. There is no credible way to get the entire nation of people to believe that all of their ancestors, every Jew alive at the time, witnessed God appearing to them at Mount Sinai, other than to say it happened. The uniqueness of this Jewish claim makes it makes one pause before sort of joining the mix of everyone else. And it's fascinating that Moshe himself alludes to this point. He says, "For ask now regarding the early days that were before you, since the day that God created man upon the earth, and from one end of the heavens to the other end of the heavens, whether there was anything like this great thing, or was the likes of it heard? Did ever a people hear God's voice speaking out of the midst of the fire as you have heard and live?" The plain meaning of this verse is that Moshe is saying that God never revealed himself this way before, and later he goes on to say that God will never reveal himself this way to people in the future. No other religion has ever made this claim that the Torah makes. I want to just conclude with this last reading on page 204. The divine revelation at Sinai was a fact witnessed by millions of people. We'll talk about that maybe after class. All of whom reported it to its minutest detail accurately, for the whole people of Israel stood upon Sinai and witnessed it. We know that this is a fact because millions of Jews in our day accepted as such because they received it as such from their own parents. And these millions in turn received evidence from the previous generation, and so on in an uninterrupted chain of transmitted evidence from millions to millions of witnesses, generation after generation, back to the original